Thank you, Kairat, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I have to say, I have a major dose of imposter syndrome following a WHO consultant and a Knight of the Realm. Yesterday I was the roving mic boy, so I've come a long way in 24 hours. Okay, I want to transport you seamlessly to the panel session on a wave of hope and optimism. I'm going to talk about the educational challenge in the deep end and beyond. So obviously, we recognise that many of these challenges do not just apply to GPs in the most deprived areas. And where better place to start than with a quote from Julian Tudor-Hart. Our system of medical education is still designed to produce community clinicians only as a byproduct, an afterthought following a core curriculum designed by and for specialists. Its central aim remains the production of specialist excellence, unsullied by prior contact with the society it serves. It is training the wrong people at the wrong time, in the wrong skills, and in the wrong place. He goes on. The core curriculum for all doctors should be primary care. This should be taught where it is actually carried out within communities. And the primary generalists produced in this way require not a year or two of rehabilitation in specialised vocational training, but a lifetime of in-service postgraduate study. Now, this was written over 30 years ago, and I think we have come some distance since then, but I think we still have some way to travel. And this is the standard curriculum continuum that we have in terms of medical education, and I'm going to just reflect on a few opportunities that I've had to chip in at each of these stages, most recently through the Deep End GP Pioneer Scheme, which Petra presented so eloquently this morning. And that role as academic coordinator allowed me to get involved with the REACH programme at Glasgow and the Glasgow Access programme in terms of widening access to the professions. I've been involved in GP teaching with Andrea Williamson on Global Health BSc at the University of Glasgow, and in a special student-selected component, apologies Andy, there's quite a few acronyms here, not Andy, John, which is a 5-week module specifically around social determinants. I've done some GP teaching with GP trainees. My very first research project was around GP trainers' attitudes towards health inequalities. And most recently of all, we've myself and several colleagues in the room have developed a west of Scotland. So we're trying to broaden out from just Glasgow across the west of Scotland. It's no longer just early career. I think we're going to open up to all GPs, but a deprivation interest group for GPs, a community of learning, if you like. So what I'm going to talk about is largely represented in this article that I wrote last year. And basically what I'm covering is challenges and some potential solutions. So I'm going to start with general challenges, which apply to the whole of GP education, and then some specific challenges for the deep end. No better place to start in terms of general challenges than with the Valois report, By Choice, Not by Chance. And she describes 3 kind of key issues within the undergraduate exposure that medical students have. And these are partly the formal curriculum, but also largely the hidden curriculum. The first one is tribalism, the perception of GP as being a lower status specialty. Negativism, which relates to the low morale within the profession itself and how that can impact and rub off on students. And then the third one was finance. Probably the most important one is the lack of equity of reimbursement for education between primary care and hospitals. Other general challenges relate to the proportion of medical school graduates that go on to GP training posts. And you can see from this that there's wide variation across different medical schools. Edinburgh not doing particularly well, Glasgow marginally better, Aberdeen is the best in Scotland, but Keele and Lancaster for the UK are producing 30%, and obviously bear in mind that a proportion of graduates will go on to FY3, 4, 5, 6. You know, we're seeing that increasingly extending the foundation years. But that proportion of 30% is still short of the 50%, which we should be, in an ideal world, aiming for. Moving on to specific challenges for the deep end, and number one among these is the inverse care law. As we've heard throughout today and yesterday, the inverse care law manifests in a lack of time, and that obviously affects capacity to engage with medical education. Number two, inverse training law. This is data from a paper in publication by Marianne McCallum and colleagues. Things have changed a little bit. So in 2009, Mark Russell and colleagues produced a snapshot of where the training practices in Scotland were, and he found that 100 of those were in the most affluent quartile compared to 58 in the most deprived. So nearly double the number of training practices in the most affluent versus the most deprived. Percentage-wise, close to 40% compared to 22%, where you would expect 25% if it was absolutely equally distributed. And things have improved, so 38 to 28, so hopefully that's one small signal of optimism. But clearly, if you're trained, we heard from Austin this morning, if you're trained in an area of deprivation, or conversely, if you're not, then you maybe have more apprehensions, you're less likely to go on and work in an area of deprivation afterwards. And thirdly, another crucial area again, which I think, in many ways, this talk is redundant because Austin's done it all already this morning and much better. But the content of medical education is qualitatively different. And that relates not just to whether you call it social medicine, deprivation medicine, the high volume of marginalization, of addictions, of mental health, of trauma. The balance of the art versus the science of medicine. And we see the technology that is across all specialties increases year on year on year. And that, if you can imagine, incorporating into medical curriculum, squeezes out more and more and more time for the interpersonal, the art. The limitations in the context of multimorbidity of evidence-based medicine itself, and we could talk at length about that. But in a nutshell, that most research which informs guidelines is done on specialized populations who exclude not just people with multimorbidity, but increasingly people with complex social backgrounds as well. So where do we go from here? Again, I turn to Julian and his, again, writing close to 45 years ago, suggested that it's not a question of fragmentary teaching of primary care as a specialty, letting students have small, safe doses of general practice in sterile conditions, or indeed of image projection to improve recruitment, but of using the unique opportunities to expand and deepen the education of all students destined for all specialties. And he suggested that there are three specific tasks for which general practice and the community setting has a particular advantage over hospitals in the context of educating future doctors. And these are the three things. The first is the correction of social ignorance, developing real respect and real concern for real people, when increasingly we have increasing social distance between professions and many of the populations that we try to care for. The second is coping with uncertainty and understanding the limitations of knowledge, not just our own individual knowledge, but the whole body of knowledge, and managing the many, many grey areas inherent in that. And the third is the development of a disciplined anger, and hopefully Austin would appreciate this, not against people, but against attitudes and situations that impede care. And I highly recommend this paper to any, not just educators, but also medical students, GP trainees, indeed everyone in this auditorium. So moving back to the continuum that we showed earlier of the different stages and potential solutions. And these are, certainly notes of optimism again. So in terms of widening access, we need to think about not just helping improve the diversity of the medical student population by helping the getting ready element of the process, which the REACH programme does, but also thinking about the getting in process, the selection process. And there's been calls, certainly within the University of Glasgow, to widen the number of GPs on selection panels. It's still very heavily weighted towards specialists. In terms of undergraduate curriculum, we have last year, for the first time ever, we have an undergraduate curriculum for general practice developed jointly by the Society of Academic Primary Care and the Royal College. We've never had that before. We could argue the pros and cons of that, but I would say that's a positive step. There's a call to increase the quantity and quality of time spent in general practice from 8%, as it currently is, to 25%, which to me still seems quite low. There's COMET, another horrible acronym, but it's to do with, this is another Glasgow University scheme for a community-oriented medical track of training right through the undergraduate years. More focus on social determinants, potentially more interprofessional learning. Moving on to postgraduate. Programs like the tailored GP training we've seen in North Dublin and in Greater Manchester. You know, why should we not have tailored programs of GP training for different populations? The idea of rotating through different practices, if you have 18 months of GP training, which is community-based, practice-based, or even a year, even 2 years, you know, hopefully 3 years in the future, I don't know. But there's surely scope to rotate through possibly 2 different types of practices within that 18-month or 2-year period. Greater proportion of foundation year placements in general practice to give all doctors an understanding of what general practice is like. We talk a lot about improving the quality of relationships between patients and doctors. We spend less time talking about our dysfunctional relationships with colleagues, not just within primary care, because that's not normally so bad, but particularly at times with secondary care colleagues. And we've heard about near-peer teaching as well, and I think that's another certainly green shoot to my mind. In terms of lifelong learning, the boost that has been provided in the Pioneer Scheme with a little bit of protected time for education and training. Our hospital colleagues get it. We struggled at times to have it with PLT. We need that. That needs to be incorporated into everyone's contract to have some protected time for learning and service development. Fellowship schemes are great, but only available to a few people. The idea of developing a coalition of learning, again, is great, but it's happening after hours predominantly, so how sustainable is that? And groups like PBSGL and just general peer support have to be part of the lifelong learning process. But if I were to pick 2 things, I'm going to defer to more experienced medical education colleagues. So Hugh Alberti and Bob McKinley wrote a response to my article in which they said, great, lovely paper, but specifically we need further additional investment and support. It's the inverse care law, right? We cannot, their words, abandon our learners to learn in practices which are struggling to manage their clinical service. These practices need targeted investment. And the second point was, again, I mentioned it earlier, but the urgent need for an equitable undergraduate tariff for GP on par with secondary care. Close to the end now of this talk is about practitioner well-being. Hopefully, yep. Practitioner well-being. Practitioner well-being has been a core feature of all the Deep End projects described so far. But I would just like to add, in relation to that no amount of resilience training will alter the working conditions which create stress and burnout. So the context is key. More reasons to be hopeful. Everything we've heard today. So on the left, you have the pathway from deprivation medicine, the shared health guys in Manchester, going right from inspiring students right through every stage of that continuum. North Dublin training scheme, Fair Health. GP Society, one of many medical student GP societies, and it was really them that kind of collaborated with myself and colleagues within the Deep End to put on the medical student conferences which we've had, which have been the most inspiring events that I've ever had the pleasure of being involved in. The WISE GP is an initiative from Joanne Reeve and colleagues within SAPC, the Society for Academic Primary Care, and I think the academic aspect of general practice in primary care has to rise to the challenge too. So what could the future look like? Well, to conclude with some words from Churahart, Sir Geoffrey Vickers, and this chap is definitely worth a quick Google, quite a character. He described the history of public health as a record of successive redefinings of the unacceptable. In medical education, we should be redefining the intolerable, helping new generations to reject what we have bent to and to express their rejection in great deeds and short words. Departments of primary care could, and in a few cases will, be innovators of an education of this new kind. I've just realised I've still got 5 minutes to go. I'm not going to take all that 5 minutes, but I will just finish with a short chapter. I don't have a poem or a declaration of love, but I've got a short reading from this book, and it's a book by a chap called Victor Montori, who is, I think, a kindred spirit on the other side of the Atlantic. So this is a Peruvian, but he works in the Mayo Clinic in the States, and he's written a book called Why We Revolt. And in the book, he describes these human castles or human pyramids in Spain. It's a tradition in many parts of Spain, or castels in the Spanish. And I just want to read, this is actually the final paragraph of the book, and he says, "This castell is almost finished. The last one, a precious child, is climbing to its top. Her parents, holding on to their fellow castellers at the base, trusting everyone else, await nervously for the music to signal their daughter's arrival to the summit. They are enveloped by a deep sense of care for and about each other. They are surrounded by love. As she climbs, that little girl will not feel lonely. As she stands at the top, she will not think she got there just because of her own effort and courage. For if she were just to look down, she would see everyone in the village, her whole world, holding her, raising her, helping her touch the moon." Thank you.